Welcome to another Swordmaster Publications presentation. My name is Ernie Lawrence. Today we will be studying Judges chapter 2. Now, Judges chapter 2 is kind of a summary introduction to the rest of the book. We're going to see a little bit of callback to the book of Judges. We're going to see a little bit of callback to the Pentateuch in places, and then we're going to see the way that the author of the book of Judges comes out. And a lot of people believe that the author is Samuel, but we're going to see the way that the author goes through and says, hey, this is the pattern back and forth of the children of Israel during this time period. The book of Judges spans about 348 years. It does not say that within the book of Judges, but if you look at the time indications that are given in Kings and Chronicles, if you look at the time indications that are given in the books of Moses, then you can derive that from those time periods that are given, kind of link them up together, do a little bit of math, and I've done that. I've actually got my Bible timeline here put together, and you can see that it all adds up, and I've given the references for where all of these things are found. So it takes about 348 years to get through this book, but let's go ahead and get started, and hopefully it won't take us that long to get through this chapter today. Verse 1, And an angel of Jehovah came up from Gilgal to Bochum, and said, I made you to go up out of Egypt, and I have brought you to the land which I swear unto your fathers, and I said, I will never break my covenant with you. Now here's, right out of the bat here with the chapter, we have a problem with the word "and." The word, the article there that's used, "an," is not actually in the Hebrew, and you're going to see in verse 4 here it says the angel of Jehovah. But more importantly, if you read the context here and you look at the way that the angel is speaking, it says, I made you to go up out of Egypt. Well, we know that this is God. We know that it was Jesus who was the rock that followed them throughout the wilderness. He was the fiery pillar. He was the cloud. All of those things were Jesus Christ before he was incarnate. We would say God the Son or the Son of God. And a lot of the times, and I've shown this throughout the books of Moses and in the book of Joshua, where we see the angel of the Lord, that word angel just means messenger. And the number one, the archangel, the primary messenger of God the Father is God the Son. And so here again we have this angel, this messenger, who is the Son of God, who has come down to them in this place called Bochum. And he tells them, I'm the one that made you to go up out of Egypt and have brought you into the land that I swear to your fathers. So he's done this. This is God that's done this. And he said, I will never break my covenant with you. And so this covenant is God's covenant with Israel. Once again, we see here the angel of the Lord in this context is God. It's his covenant. Furthermore, he says, I will never break my covenant with you. God does not do that. The entire time that we see the 1500 years from Egypt all the way up until the cross, God never one time breaks his covenant with his people. And this is one of the big reasons that we know that God is faithful and just to keep his promises, because every time he had the opportunity, he could have removed himself from the contract, because Israel broke it so many times, over and over and over again. God could have said, you broke the contract, I'm sorry, you're done. But he didn't do that. He said, I will never break my covenant with you. And he doesn't. He keeps it the entire time, regardless of the faithlessness of Israel that we're going to see time and time again here in the book of Judges and across the entirety of their history moving forward. This is what he said. He said, I will never break my covenant with you. And you, this is their part. Whenever we have a contract with God's covenants are set up with two parts. There's the part that God's going to do, and he never doesn't do it. He always does the thing that he said he's going to do. And then there's man's part. God always works this way. He works, it's an indication of our free will, is that there are two parts. There's always two parts. Even in the New Testament, God's covenant of the New Testament, which is for all mankind, God says, here's my part. I gave you my son. I gave you the gospel. I gave you the New Testament, the pattern to live by. Your part is to have this living faith, to follow after and obey the commands that I've given you in the New Testament. That's what God says our part is. And even though we may sometimes break those commandments, God still never breaks his covenant with us. And he will forgive us when we do transgress, when we go outside and break this contract that he has made with us. So this is part of the covenant that he has made with them. You shall make no league, that is, you're not going to join in together as equals with the inhabitants of this land. You're not going to make allies with these guys. Okay? And he says, furthermore, you shall throw down their altars. But you have not obeyed my voice. Why have you done this? Now remember, going back into the book of Joshua, God gives them the land, and they take the land. They are now in control of the promised land, to the point that Reuben and Gad, the tribes of Reuben and Gad and the half-tribe of Manasseh, got to go back to their families. So the promise was fulfilled. But they did not keep their part. And I think this really drives home the idea of God kept his part of the promise that he made to them to deliver the promised land to them. He kept his word. He did his part, but they did not do their part. And this is the cycle over and over and over again. And I think that's why the book of Judges is so powerful, is because it shows in a singular book the pattern that Israel follows for its entire history. It says, why have you done this? You have not obeyed my voice. They did not throw down the altars, and they are making these leagues or these contracts, these treaties with these other nations that God said they're not supposed to do. And so verse 3, wherefore I also said, I will not drive them out from before you, but they shall be as thorns in your side, and their God shall be a snare unto you. Well, where does he say this? He said this in Numbers 33, verse 55. So they were going to go in, they were going to drive out all of the pagan nations. They weren't going to let them stay. But God says, if you will not drive out the inhabitants of the land from before you, then it shall come to pass that those which you let remain of them shall be pricks in your eyes, and thorns in your sides, and shall vex you in the land wherein you dwell. Moreover, it shall come to pass that I shall do unto you as I thought to do unto them. Some powerful words here. First of all, we see that God has told them that when you go into the land, you have a choice. You can drive them all out, or you can let some remain. Now, that's not him giving his authoritative permission. In other words, he's not saying, I'm saying it's okay for you to do that, but he's saying you have two choices. You can listen to me and obey me and get rid of all of these wicked nations, but you can also choose not to obey me and leave some of them. And if you do, this is what's going to happen. And so here in the book of Judges, the angel, God the Son, is reminding them of what was said in Numbers 33. I said this, if you don't drive them out, they're going to be as thorns in your side, and their gods are going to be a snare unto you. And that's exactly what happens. This is what we see through the book of Judges the entire time. Like I said, this is a summary of the rest of the book. And so it says in verse 4, and it came to pass when the angel of Jehovah, notice here that the translators use the angel and they used an angel up here, but this is the same angel. And it came to pass when the angel of Jehovah spoke these words unto all the children of Israel, that the people lifted up their voice and wept. And they called the name of the place Bochim, which means wept or weeping, and they sacrificed there unto Jehovah. So they heard this message. The children, when this angel comes down, when the archangel comes down and says, you guys messed up, they're sad about it, because this is still in the time period just shy removed of Joshua. In fact, we're going to kind of have an iteration here of all the things that happened with Joshua and the generation right after Joshua. that was actually in the book of Joshua itself. But the people there wept; they were sad because they realized that what they had done was wrong. Problem is, their sorrow did not bring about repentance. And what I mean by that is they did not turn around and then drive out all of the people and break down the altars and do all the things that God said. So they were sad. It was like the little kid who got caught doing something he shouldn't be doing, but he's not sorrowful in the sense of we did wrong, I'm going to change. They're sorrowful that they got caught. They're sorrowful that God is reprimanding them. Is what I get out of this, because what does God say? I would prefer to have obedience rather than sacrifice. But here, all they do is they sacrifice. But they don't. It doesn't say that they drove out all of the nations. It doesn't say that they broke down the altars. It just says that they wept and they sacrificed, as if that's going to do anything. So then we have a summary here. It says, "And when Joshua had let the people go, the children of Israel went every man unto his inheritance to possess the land. And the people served Jehovah all the days of Joshua and all the days of the elders that outlived Joshua, who had seen all the great works works of Jehovah that he had done for Israel. Joshua the son of Nun, the servant of Jehovah, died, being 110 years old. And they buried him in the border of his inheritance in Timnath-Heres in the mount of Ephraim on the north side of the hill of Gash." And this is all found in Joshua chapter 24 in verse 31. Okay, so they're gonna recapitulate or restate all the things that were in the book of Joshua. Part of that is giving legitimacy to this book of Judges. These quotes that we have, that's one of the reasons we know which books go in the Bible, is they interconnect. They quote one another, and that's why they're considered inspired. Not that that's the only thing. There's obviously other things that go as well, but that's one of the things. And then in verse 10, "And also all that generation were gathered unto their fathers, and there arose another generation after them, which knew not Jehovah, nor yet the works which he had done for Israel." And this is interesting because I saw in this verse a parallel, and I was like, why does it sound familiar? If you go over to Exodus chapter 1 and verse 8, it says, "Now there arose up a new king over Egypt, which knew not Joseph." So if you compare the two, you have a generation that comes up, that's a new generation that is unaware of the things of the past. 2 points to make. Number one, this is just the old saying of those who don't know history are doomed to repeat it, because that's straight out of the Bible here. Every time we see a new generation that comes up that's ignorant of the past, they end up repeating the past. Number two, this is one of those early comparisons of the Israelites to Egypt. When you get to the book of Revelation, it says that there was a city that's called Sodom in Egypt. Well, how many times is the Israelites or Jerusalem or the Jews compared to Egypt throughout the Old Testament? Well, here's one of them. They don't even have Jerusalem yet. Jerusalem hasn't been like settled as the capital or anything along those lines, and already they're being compared to Egypt, and we saw that through the books of Moses a little bit. We're seeing here that you have this generation that rises up that didn't know Jehovah, just as there was a generation of Egyptians that rose up that didn't know Joseph, who was God's man among them. All right, verse 11, it says, "And the children of Israel did evil in the sight of Jehovah and served Balaam." That word Baal there is a word for Lord, or we might think of it in terms of like a mini god or a demigod or a pagan god or a fake god, or however you want to say it. But Balaam, it's just a plural form of the word Lord. So this is actually lords. But to the Canaanites, Balaam was also an individual. They had a kind of a mockery, if you will, of the triune God, in that they had a bunch of lords or a bunch of false pagan gods who were all kind of wrapped up into a singular god. Now they didn't just have three; they had a whole bunch, but their pantheon was kind of embodied in or represented by this one person, Balaam. So when you see Balaam, you can see that both as a singular individual, obviously fake person, not really a real person, but they thought that it was a real person. But you can also understand it that these are the gods of the Canaanites, the pagan gods, the fake false gods that are made out of stone and sticks, and not really, they can't really do anything. So anyway, they served Balaam. They leave serving Jehovah and they go to serve Balaam, these fake false gods. It says they forsook the Jehovah God of their fathers, which brought them out of the land of Egypt. Notice that keeps getting repeated. How much that the writers remind them, hey, look at what God did for you. He brought you out of slavery. And remember the parallel that we know that is. Bringing them out of Egypt was the type, pointing to the antitype of being brought out of sin in the New Testament. So he reminds them over and over again, basically, that I brought you out of wickedness, I brought you out of slavery, and I brought you to freedom. And they're leaving God and they're turning back. Apostasy is possible. It's possible in the Old Testament, it's possible in the New Testament. They forsook Jehovah God of their fathers, which brought them out of the land of Egypt, followed other gods, of the gods of the people that were round about them, and bowed themselves unto them, and provoked Jehovah to anger. What is the very first commandment? You shall have no other gods before me. And that doesn't mean that you can worship me primarily, and then you can worship these other guys kind of secondarily. That's not what that means. It means you may not worship other gods. Period. None. And here they are. They have left God, and they are now worshiping these fake false gods that can't do anything. They're worshiping sticks and stones rather than the almighty creator of everything. It says they forsook Jehovah and served Baal. So now we're kind of talking about Baal more as this singular representation of the pantheon, this person that is the Canaanite god, more specifically the male part of the Canaanite gods. And then Ashtaroth or Ashtoreth is the female side of that. So if you think Baal represents, it means Lord, but if you add the I am to the end of it, it's plural. So you have El versus Elohim. That's your plural in terms of God, but Elohim is also used as a plural singular, so that's where we kind of get the idea of a godhead from. And then Anak versus Anakim. That's Anak was kind of one of the giants after the flood, and then the Anakim were his children, so plural giants. These were the lords, the false gods that they didn't drive out, but also the singular. And then when you get to Ashtoreth, her name means star. She's the pagan goddess of fertility and war. She's seen in multiple pagan civilizations under various names. So that's what the civilizations would do, is they would share their mythologies. They would share their pantheons. They would just give them different names based on their personal languages. So Egypt had their set of gods, which is very convoluted. We saw a lot of that when the Israelites were leaving Exodus and we studied the 10 plagues. The Canaanites, the Phoenicians, the Hittites, Perizzites, all those guys, they had their gods, and then those bled over into Babylon and then on into the Medo-Persians and then Greece and then Rome. All of those pantheons are interrelated. People had their local names, but overall, these deities, they're not exactly the same, but they're so connected you can tell that there is a definite, like if you look at Venus and Aphrodite, it's the same person essentially, but you also have versions of her in other civilizations that are not quite exactly the same, but you can tell that they kind of riff off of each other. Ashtoreth is like that. She's the pagan goddess of fertility and war, and she was called Ishtar in Egypt, Eoster in all the way up in Germany. By the time Germany becomes a thing, kind of around the Roman Empire time, and then that's also where we derive the modern ideas of Easter eggs and bunnies. What is the egg and what does the bunny have to do with the resurrection of Christ? Because everybody says Easter's the resurrection of Christ and whatever. Well, why are bunnies involved? Why are Easter eggs involved? It's because the Catholics came along and they tried to absorb the pagans into their Catholicism in order to fill their coffers, and they really Christianized a lot of pagan religions, and we can see those brought forth into the symbols that are used, particularly the idea of bunnies. Eggs, a lot of people are going to say, well, that's just new life and spring or whatever, but those are symbols of fertility. Those are not symbols of resurrection. And then Ashtoreth may also have connections to Tammuz, which you can read about in Ezekiel 8:14, Lent, and other non-biblical traditions. So, all right, it says, "And the anger of Jehovah was hot against Israel, and he delivered them into the hands of spoilers that spoiled them, and he sold them into the hands of their enemies round about, so that they could not any longer stand before their enemies." So when they go after these false gods, God says, fine, I'm not defending you anymore. You fight your own battles. And every time, remember, Israel, when God picked Israel, Israel was not the biggest, was not the strongest. There was nothing physically superior about Israel. He picked the weak. Jacob was the weaker brother out of Jacob and Esau. And Israel is like that. Without God, they lose. All the time. Every time, 100% of the time. Without God, they lose. When they are faithful to God and God is with them, they win every time. And that's just the history of Israel. That's the point of the Old Testament. With God, victory is assured. Without God, defeat is assured. I mean, it's a no-brainer, but they don't get the lesson, and so many people today don't get that lesson. But here it is, kind of in a nutshell. Verse 15 says, "Whithersoever they went out, the hand of Jehovah was against them for evil." That word doesn't mean that God is doing evil in the sense of sinfulness, but evil in terms of calamity or destruction. The Hebrew word there doesn't necessarily always mean wickedness or sinfulness, but evil as in not in your best interest. That they were going out and they were losing battles, and God was taking part in that. And so it says, "As Jehovah had said, and as Jehovah had sworn unto them, and they were greatly distressed." What did God say? You get into the land and you don't take these people out, that you start worshiping their false gods, I will be set against you, and I will bring them. And we have this history of God using foreign nations, wicked nations, to chastise and bring judgment against Israel over and over and over again. And it kind of starts in the books of law when we see this a little bit in terms of like the book of Numbers, a little bit in Joshua, it's hinted at, but here in the book of Judges, it just comes on full bore, this idea that God uses foreign nations to bring judgment against Israel for their unfaithfulness. And it's throughout the history of Israel, up into and including the Romans coming in and sacking Jerusalem and destroying the temple and ending them once and for all. And so that's where this pattern really gets started. Okay, verse 16, "Nevertheless, Jehovah raised up judges." So here's this kind of summary of what is going to happen throughout the rest of the book. "Nevertheless, Jehovah raised up judges, which delivered them out of the hand of those that spoiled them. And yet they would not hearken unto their judges, but they went a-whoring after other gods, and bowed themselves unto them, and turned quickly out of the way which their fathers walked in, obeying the commandments of Jehovah, but they did not so." So, first of all, note that this is written in the past tense. This is somebody who is after this time period. This is why a lot of people think Samuel wrote it. But this is a summary of what's going to happen for the rest of the book. And it's a looking back at Israel's history at this point. And then also notice this word here. We're seeing, well, if I can click on it right, we're seeing this association of Israel, and later with the city of Jerusalem, which represents Israel or represents Judah, as a prostitute. All throughout the Old Testament, she is pictured as a prostitute. When you get to the book of Revelation and you see the prostitute in Revelation 17, why on earth would you think it's anything but Jerusalem and the Jews? There's nothing in Scripture ever that would make you think that the whore, that the prostitute, the harlot that is riding on the beast is anything other than Judah and Jerusalem. It's absurd because you have to invent that and bring it to the text. To say that the woman represents Rome because she sits on 7 hills. Number one, Jerusalem sat on 7 hills as well. But number two, the sitting on the 7 hills, the sitting on the beast, would represent the prostitute, the harlot, in collusion with the beast. And her sitting on the 7 hills was the Herod's relationship with the Caesars. But the prostitute, the harlot that we see in Revelation, is absolutely Judah and Jerusalem, and she's called that all throughout the Old Testament. You've gone whoring after other gods. You've sold yourself to foreign nations for their wealth, for their protection, whatever. He calls them that over and over and over again because he's angry with them, and that's what they've done, is they have sold themselves to these foreign nations. Instead of relying on God, who is their husband, he calls them that later on. You'll see that in Ezekiel chapter 16 and other places. He says, "You were my bride, and you were unfaithful to me. You went and played the prostitute when you should have been faithful to me. I would have provided everything you wanted. I was providing everything you could have ever wanted. And you still went after these other fake false gods." And of course he's going to be mad. So anyway, he sends these judges, and they don't listen. Verse 18, "And when Jehovah raised them up judges, then Jehovah was with the judge and delivered them out of the hand of their enemies all the days of that judge, for it repented Jehovah because of their groanings, by reason of them that oppressed them and vexed them." So we're sorry, please help us. God sends a judge to help them, brings them out of captivity, and all the days that that judge is alive, kind of like when Joshua was alive or Moses was alive or whatever, you have this faithfulness. But then when that judge dies, you have another generation that pops up. They're not personally experiencing the things that God did through the judge, and so they fall back into idolatry again. Like, they do not know their history. They do not learn it. It's so frustrating to read about the Israelites, and just like it's so frustrating for us today to read about history and look at what America is doing, and you just want to slap people. Like, are you an idiot? This has never worked, and you're going to try it again? Stop. But that's what the Israelites do. They keep repeating their past mistakes. "And it came to pass when the judge was dead that they returned and corrupted themselves more than their fathers." So they got worse. It's kind of like some of these diets you get on and you lose a little bit of weight, then you get off the diet and you end up weighing more than what you did when you started the diet. "So they corrupted themselves more than their fathers, and following other gods to serve them and to bow down unto them, they ceased not from their own doings, nor further from their stubborn way." Man, if there's a word to describe them other than prostitute, stubborn describes them. "The anger of Jehovah was hot against Israel, and he said, because that this people has transgressed my covenant." Remember, God says, "I'm not going to break my covenant," but Israel breaks it all the time. They break it more than they're faithful to it. "They have transgressed my covenant, which I commanded their fathers, and have not hearkened unto my voice. I will not henceforth drive out any from before them of the nations which Joshua left when he died." He says, "I'm done driving these guys out. I'm not driving any more of these guys out. They're going to be here for the rest of their history." And they are. All of these people that they didn't drive out, because they go back and forth in the book of Judges so many times, God says, "You know what? Forget it. They're going to be here for the rest of the time. You had your chance. I'm not driving them out. You guys, good luck." And then it says that I may prove Israel. Now that word there isn't God saying I need to prove something to myself. The idea of proving Israel is refining them, figuring out, not God figuring out, but Israel kind of figuring out through trial who's going to be faithful to God and who is not. It's like a proving of metal, refining process. And so God is putting them through this kind of gauntlet of these foreign nations to show to the people. These of you, you ever wonder if I lived in this time period, would I have been one of the faithful? Would I have, if I was tested, if I'm going to be tested, maybe in our lives we're going to be tested, would you be willing to die for your faith? Well, a lot of people say yes while things are going good, but when then it comes down to it, somebody's got a gun to your head, in that moment, am I going to die for the cause of Christ? And so that's the kind of proving that's going on here that God does for them. And then it says, therefore Jehovah left those nations without driving them out hastily, neither delivered he them into the hand of Joshua. So this goes all the way back. And I said this before in the book of Joshua, that there were people that were not driven out, even in the time of Joshua. God declares his promise fulfilled. But Joshua and the people made choices not to drive everybody out the way that God said to. And God says, if you don't do it, they're going to be a thorn in your side. Even though the people were faithful during the time of Joshua and for the time period just after that, the people that they left ended up corrupting their descendants afterwards. And so Joshua was not as good at following after what God said as maybe Moses wasn't, but even Moses made his mistakes, right? So that's Judges chapter 2. Again, it's a summary. We've set up what the rest of the book is going to look like. We're going to start getting into some specific judges. One of the things to keep in mind here is that we're going to cover a whole lot of time span here, and you're going to see that this judge ruled for this many years and whatever, but they don't all cover this, like they're not covering the entirety of Israel. Some of these judges were co-ruling or co-judging at the same time, and they only helped certain sections of Israel. And so that overlap has to be taken into account when we say 348 years. But that is Judges chapter 2, an interesting chapter to be sure. I hope you were able to gain something from this study. I look forward to future studies with you. As always, like, subscribe, leave your comments. Love discussing it, and we will see you next time. My name is Ernie Lawrence. This has been another Swordmaster Publications presentation.